Tiny and Big Grandpa's Leftovers was an indie puzzle platformer released on June 19th, 2012. 8 years have gone by since it's released, and honestly, I remember buying this when it came out. It was one of those games that kind of caught my interest because it's an indie puzzle platformer where you basically cut rocks with a giant laser and then try to get to the end of the goal with platforms you create by cutting these rocks. And I'd say it's a unique mechanic that not many other games have even tried. I mean, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance sorta did it. I don't want to get footage for that game, cut this out. I remember playing this game on my laptop, and to get it to run I had to drop the resolution and the textures and all that just to get like 20 frames a second because my laptop was not exactly the best thing ever. But since then I've got a medium-end PC that can run pretty much anything at decent frames, so I decided to take a look back at Tiny and Big, Grandpa's Leftovers. Is it as good as I remembered? Well, let's find out. The first thing you notice when you gander upon this game is going to be the art direction, how it looks, the style they use, and how it works with the game engine and mechanics. Now, when I say that, what I mean is it's a very simple art style. You're gonna notice that a lot of the objects and blocks in this game are very, simple. They don't have a lot of edges or contours. They're just kind of regular blocks to play around with. I gotta say, it's a small stroke of genius to set this game in the desert because that makes plenty of excuses as to why you're only cutting rocks and not architecture, and you don't really have to deal with that too much. You are limited to what you can cut. For instance, you can't cut everything, but you can cut most objects pretty easily. The style really does work well with the game, keeping things simple and, it's very nice to look at. So what's the story? You play as Tiny. Your taxi crashes in the desert and you start cutting down stuff to try and progress through each map. Basically, you're chasing your brother or your cousin or whatever because he stole your grandfather's antique pants, underwear for us Americans. And these pants hold a lot of power. Basically, wearing these pants is going to make you very powerful, Your goal is basically to try and stop Big before he does something stupid with all this power. There's also a backstory for these pair of pants that Big stole. It turns out they're a very powerful pair that were used to slaughter a race of mole people, basically. I'm summarizing a bit, but whatever, it's not entirely important. Spoiler alert, at the end of the game you do defeat Big and he loses his pair of pants and then a mole steals it, and that's basically the end, and you both walk off into the sunset while the credits roll. It's a very simple story. It doesn't really need to be that in-depth when it comes to a puzzle platformer, especially made by a small studio like this. It's simple, it's all it really needs to be. You don't need anything too complex. It feels right, it feels at home in this kind of game. Next, let's talk about gameplay. How does the game feel to play? Well, it's fairly smooth and intuitive. Rarely does it feel clunky, and even in cramped quarters, you'll be able to move pretty freely. The camera will stick to you no matter what, so you don't have to worry about it getting caught on level geometry, so that's nice. The only real issue I have is that every time you look directly down, your character moves at an angle instead of exactly where you're trying to point him. It's a small quirk, but honestly, it's not enough to really kill the game for me. There's not a lot of precision platforming in this game. The frame rate stays pretty consistent, which is nice. I mean, I expected frames to drop, constantly, considering we're just cutting objects and making more objects for the engine to handle. Basically, you run around and cut objects, and that's basically it. There's not much else to do. You just cut objects and get through these levels, platforming and pushing and pulling objects to make little bridges to try and get to the end. When it comes to controls, how does the game work? Well, basically you jump, you cut rocks, and then you push or pull said cut stuff. You use your mouse to look around, and you also use it to cut lines through these objects and, try and make bridges and stuff with them. You also use a rope to pull stuff and a rocket to push stuff. The goal is to try and cut and move stuff around so you can navigate to the end of any given level. In the levels, you will also find boring stones to collect. I'm not exaggerating, those are literally boring stones. The game calls them that. See? Look at that. These boring stones are often placed around a map to try and lead you towards the correct direction to go. So basically, these are just little breadcrumbs left by the developers to try and guide a player. For what it's worth, it works pretty well. The levels aren't the most expansive thing in the world. A lot of them boil down to strict linearity, and that's perfectly okay for a game like this. The point of the game is not that it's complex and free roaming. The point is, here's a small physics engine we made, cut stuff and try to get to the end. So overall, the controls are pretty nice, and I don't really have any complaints, honestly. There's no timer, there's no pressure, it's just a short game where you try to basically jump around and navigate these maps. And while you're playing, you're gonna hear some sweet tunes. That's right, the soundtrack is actually really nice and I enjoy it quite a bit. I remember going back to buy the soundtrack once I finished the game because honestly, a lot of these are bangers and a lot of them are really nice. I'm gonna use some of my favorite tunes from this game in the background of this video. Hopefully it'll show you what kind of vibe this game is going for. I'd suggest checking out the soundtrack if you're curious. I'd say it's worth a listen and it's definitely worth a buy if you dig it. It's a really good soundtrack to cut rocks to. Also, the theme song for the game, Little Pretty Thing, is pretty nice. I like it. I don't know, it's just kind of, it vibes with me, you know? When playing the game, you can also find little cassette tapes scattered throughout the level in hidden areas usually, and these will unlock more tracks for you to listen to while you play. Some other things I should mention that didn't really fit into the categories above. For one, there's some really odd casual swearing, especially in the title track, Little Pretty Thing. No, I got that furious instead, and I told you, why the fuck you not listening? It's kind of weird to hear them say fuck in that song, and it's kind of out of nowhere and unnecessary. You could have easily just not said the fuck word. They also say damn it regularly throughout the game, which is really out of place, I feel. I feel like a game like this could have easily marketed itself towards children and a younger demographic. There's also arcade cabinets scattered throughout the different levels of the game. These will take you to different mini games that the developers thought would be fun to use for this engine. Some of them are way better than others. For instance, this one in the second level, you basically just shoot rockets at the back of logs and then push them into a trash bin. And then some of them are really tough for no reason, like this one in level 3 where you have to cut these different tube thingies out of the air before they land, and it's really hard sometimes. They are pretty nifty and they didn't need to be in the game, so I'm glad they're there. Another thing I should mention is that the game itself is really short. You could probably beat this in 2 hours, honestly. It's a real crying shame because I like the engine and I like what they do with it. It's just, I wish it was longer and that there was more substance here. At the end of each level, they also tell you how many cuts you made and different tapes found, rocks found, and stuff like that, and then it compares them to the par. And the challenge of the game really comes from trying to beat these maps below par. That's one way to kind of expand the game, I guess, is replaying all these maps and seeing if you can beat them better. But you know, whatever. Occasionally you'll find secret coves that have the faces of the developers, or nifty little Easter egg rooms like this music room from level 2. Also, as you traverse through these maps, you're gonna fight mini boss battles in the form of big throwing objects at you. You can cut these objects out of the air with your laser, and it's a nice test of skill and all, but the overall vibe I get is kind of meh. I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying it doesn't really add much to the game, as much as it should have or could have. One suggestion would be to make the objects a little bit larger and a lot less easy to dodge, because I feel like you can easily just walk by big and not have to worry about cutting anything. He doesn't throw the objects in front of you, he throws them at you, so, you know, as long as you're moving, you won't get hit. This does happen in the final battle where he throws gigantic things at you and it's a real cool moment, but I don't know if that moment was really worth the lack of challenge in the earlier levels from these boss battles. I think the best boss battle though is in level 3 when you're trying to cross the bridge and he's throwing rocks at you the whole time. Even though it's easy, I'd say it's a nice little challenge to kind of spice things up. Overall, I'd say they're worth having, it's just, I wish there was more out of each one. Another thing I should mention is that these collectible rocks that the developers leave throughout the levels have physics on them, so they'll roll around. This is sometimes really annoying. For example, this bridge you're supposed to make on level 2, where you cut this pillar, and there's a few of these boring rocks on them. Well, when you cut it and it falls, the rocks will bounce and have a tendency to roll out and off into the death pit. Maybe you shouldn't have put physics on all the rocks, or maybe you should have had them glued to different stuff instead. That would have made things a lot less annoying when it came to collecting them all. Another cool thing is that it feels good to cheat the system and really screw with the engine. For example, getting to lower places by just cutting stuff below you and writing it down. That's pretty fun. It's rare you'll ever use it, but it is a lot of fun when you do. The game is worth a buy if you haven't played it before, but I gotta say, only with a massive asterisk that says buy it on sale. I don't think the game is worth $10 on its own. It's just way too short. Just super short. Just unbelievably short. Usually I don't care too much about prices of games versus how many hours I get out of them, but 2 hours is just not enough. If you're curious about the game, I'd say buy it on sale. It's definitely worth a look at. I just wish it was a lot longer. Overall, Tiny and Big Grandpa's Leftovers is a decent game which suffers from being far too short. If the game was much longer, then it'd be easy to recommend for the fun gameplay alone. But as it stands, I don't think the 6 levels they give you are enough to scratch that itch. Especially since the 6th level is just a boss fight. So do I recommend Tiny and Big? Well, yes, but with a big asterisk besides that statement that reads, buy it on sale. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it, especially if you watch to the end. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Why do women only like jerks who treat them like shit?
Why do guys only want bitchy bimbos who walk all over them?